I didn't know before I began my advocacy that addiction is one of the most serious health problems in the world. With 38 million people suffering from problematic drug use, 34 million of whom are not getting any treatment at all. I had no idea that untreated addiction costs my country $600 billion a year and your country $6 billion a year. I didn't even know that addiction is a brain disorder like other mental illness. Did you know that up to 70% of all substance abusers also have a psychiatric disorder, the most prevalent being depression, anxiety disorders, and antisocial behavior? Recent science research tells us you can get this illness in a variety of ways. You can inherit it. Several dozen genes have been identified that make you more susceptible, and you could be made more vulnerable to addiction as a result of childhood traumas. It's not just the obvious traumas of sexual or physical abuse or your parents divorcing. It goes deeper than that. I'm doing a book, and I interviewed a very smart scientist at UCLA who's doing research into trauma that happens in terms of relationship and connecting trauma before you're 2 years old. If your mother or caregiver doesn't bond with you, your brain fully forms by the time you speak. That is relational trauma, which can haunt you for the rest of your life. Most of us know from the literature of Alcoholics Anonymous and other things that the root cause of alcoholism for many of us is our defective relations with others. And unless you treat this trauma with some form of therapy rather than your own self-medicating behaviors, you are going to suffer from this for the rest of your life. Something else I didn't know, and maybe you don't either, addiction travels in families. I don't mean just within families as in codependency. Every single addiction that has taken root in our culture has its fellow travelers, its own collection of secondary addictions. You know that game Whack-A-Mole? I don't know whether you have it here in New Zealand, but that thing where things pop up and you try and hit it at the amusement park. Well, that infuriating game provides a metaphor for what can happen if you attempt to treat and recover from one addiction without recognizing and treating the others you might also have. Then you run the risk of endlessly playing a version of Whack-A-Mole, with relapse being one of the many sad but predictable outcomes. The point is, the pathology of addiction manifests in multiple abuses. Someone in the throes of an alcohol or drug problem may also have a gambling compulsion, combined with an addiction to internet pornography. Studies show that most gambling addicts also have a problem with alcohol, drugs, eating disorders, and smoking cigarettes. Many anorexics and bulimics struggle with sexual compulsions and substance abuse. A hoarding compulsion often comes linked with alcohol abuse and eating disorders. Specialists call this phenomenon a transfer of addictions. It's something the world's treatment communities have thus far failed to adequately address. Few people understand in the world today, and even in our field, that addiction is first and foremost a brain disorder. Recently, the American Society of Addiction Medicine redefined addiction as a primary, chronic brain disease, not just bad behavior or bad choices. Chronic abuse of substances and activities, whether it's cocaine or gambling, result in similar changes in the same neurotransmitters of the brain. That's a scientific fact that few people are aware of. Would it make a difference in people's attitudes if they knew? I believe it will, and I believe it's our responsibility to educate them. What I knew when I began my advocacy, and what I know now, is that society often treats those struggling with addiction as if there's something wrong with them as people. I know today about the stigma and stereotypes that define how we think about this disease and those who struggle with it. And I know a transformation in the way we deal with this issue is not possible until stigma, stereotyping, and discrimination, which prevent people from getting the help they need, are obliterated. I know enough today to say we don't treat other diseases as moral failings, and we shouldn't treat this disease that way either. Not long ago, I was at a meeting in Los Angeles, California, and a woman who had 25 years of recovery stood up and she said that she worked for a very large, very prestigious real estate company in the United States. And she, every year, that company asks the employees there to write down on a note card what they are most proud of in their life. And this woman, who had 25 years of recovery, said that she wanted to write down her recovery, but she felt that she couldn't publicly say that. There would be too much stigma and risk attached to admitting what had been her proudest achievement. Isn't that a sad commentary? How can we change that? During the research that I did for this book that's going to come out in January, I was privileged to interview some very smart people, one of whom was a woman named Nora Volkow. She actually runs the National Institute of Drug Abuse in my country. She's very smart. She's a neuroscientist. She did the initial studies on brains of chimpanzees and how they're different once addicted. She told me that, she said, Chris, you know, we know a lot about prevention and we know a lot about treatment because we invest in those things. We spend no money on recovery, no money at all, and we know nothing about recovery. What recovery is, what it means, how to keep people there. She believes that if we understood recovery better, we might get more people into recovery, keep them there longer, and change attitudes about recovery and this disease. I believe that too. I began my advocacy 7 years ago, speaking out so people would know that addiction is an equal opportunity disease, that it can affect a family who has everything just as easily as it can affect a family who has nothing. Today, I speak out so people know that recovery from addiction is possible, that recovery is not just about staying away from a drink, a drug, or a behavior a day at a time, but is also about restoring and enhancing the lives of those afflicted, as well as the lives of those around them and society at large. And I speak out to urge others to do the same, because the awareness that recovery is possible, along with the spreading knowledge that science has proven these addictions are an illness in the brain, will help us to dispel many of the myths and much of the stigma surrounding diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. Aldous Huxley said that experience is not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. I was given wealth, power, and fame when I drew my first breath. Now what? My dad was a movie star. He was a member of something called the Rat Pack. This is before George Clooney, who I still have a resentment against. You know, he made a movie called Ocean's 11. I should have been in it, blah, blah, blah. I grew up in a house that was built by Louis B. Mayer, one of the great moguls of Hollywood, that sat on the sand of Santa Monica, California. Some of the people that were hanging around our pool were Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was a great friend of my parents. She taught me how to do the twist when I was 6 years old. Yeah, when I tell people that, especially men, they're like, wow, Marilyn Monroe taught you how to do the twist when you were 6? What was that like? I said, I was 6. I do remember her having a pretty dramatic impact on the adult males in the room, however. Frank Sinatra was another great friend of my parents. He was actually my sister Victoria's godfather. Her name is Victoria Frances Lawford, Frances for Frank, and she was born on November 4th for Victoria for victory. That my uncle was running for president. He was going to hopefully win the presidency. And I had godfather envy from a really young age, because Frank Sinatra would come to my sister's like second and third birthday parties with really inappropriate presents for a 2-year-old, like diamond earrings. And I barely remember meeting my godfather, much less getting anything from him. My mom was from this big Irish Catholic family in Massachusetts named the Kennedys, who nobody ever heard of prior to 1960. But in 1960, that all changed because the Democrats came to Los Angeles and they nominated my uncle to be their candidate for president. And I went to that convention. I wore a little red jacket. I have a picture of myself. My cousin Bobby Shriver sent it to me after I published my book. I thought that was kind of passive aggressive, but he did send it to me. And I had a little flag, and I was absolutely mesmerized by the American political spectacle. And Of course, I was 5, so I fell asleep in my chair. My mom brought me into my uncle's hotel room and put me in his bed, and she went back. She was a delegate. She went back and voted for her brother to be the Democratic nominee. And when my uncle was nominated and it was all done at 3 o'clock in the morning, they came in, and my uncle sat on the side of the bed and woke me up and looked at me with great purpose, and he said, Christopher, I've been nominated to be President of the United States of America. It's going to be a very hard job. Will you help me? And I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and I said, sure, Uncle Jack, but can we do it tomorrow because I'm kind of tired right now. One of my chores as a young boy was to raise a presidential flag whenever Uncle Jack came to visit. A flashbulb or a television camera often highlighted the ordinary events of my life. My bar was set pretty high. I had some pretty lofty standards to live up to. Let's see, after elementary school, I need a movie deal and a nomination. I really should get my grades up. I was born also in a family where alcoholism doesn't just run, it gallops. I'm Irish. I've heard it said that God invented alcohol to keep the Irish from ruling the world. My family almost proved him wrong. See, we had privilege, we had power, we had wealth. What we didn't understand is addiction ignores all of that. My mom and dad used to hang out at this bar called the Beachcomber Bar. Legend has it they went straight from St. John's Hospital after I was born with me and my bassinet to the Beachcomber Bar, put me on the bar, and ordered their favorite cocktail. I suppose they thought of it as kind of a hip Malibu neonatal unit or something. But that was the first place I ever went, and I thought maybe that's where I got my alcoholism. I don't think that now. Now I believe I was born with an addict's hole in my soul. It had to be filled. My first drug was sugar. Nobody really noticed because every kid in the world discovers candy and wants more. It's actually the idea behind Halloween. Now that I think of it, Halloween's sort of a perfect analogy for addiction. Going door to door, pretending to be somebody you're not, begging for more. When I was 13, I found LSD. For years, we've wondered if people were born on the immutable track of addiction, or if their life experiences or circumstances were the cause of their problems. Today, we know it is both. We simply cannot ignore the complex interplay between biology and life experience when it comes to this disease. As for the causative factors of childhood trauma, I certainly had my share. My Uncle Jack was assassinated when I was 8 years old. Also at the age of 8, my parents divorced. My Uncle Bobby was assassinated when I was 13 years old. My father died of alcoholism when he was 60. My mother was an alcoholic and a smoker. She got tongue cancer and died before she should have. When I was 12 years old and I began my drug use, no one had any idea that a kid with a genetic predisposition toward addiction and who suffers trauma in adolescence is more likely to develop a substance dependence later in life. We have come a long way in our understanding of the roots of this disease. There are millions of children throughout the world who are victimized by societal forces they have no power to control. Forces that can have a great effect on whether they become addicts later in life. For me, the fact is when you're 13 years old and your only high has been a Snickers bar, LSD can answer a lot of your questions. It's not so bad, I thought, for the first time. Now, I'm not saying Snickers is a gateway drug, but it might not be a bad idea to keep your eye on the 13-year-old who's a chocolatey mess in the corner. From the moment I took that first tab of LSD, the only thing that mattered to me for the next 17 years was where I was going to get my next drink and my next drug. Drugs and booze made me feel fortified. The world was suddenly not so scary. Better living through better chemistry became my credo. I didn't feel like there was anything I couldn't accomplish if my medicine cabinet, or yours, was fully stocked. Of course, it was an illusion. I went to prep school outside of Boston. The first question I asked when I arrived was not where the gym was or where my dorm was or where the classrooms were, but where I could find some LSD. It wasn't a secret that I was in trouble in high school, but most adolescents don't think they have a problem, and I was no exception. When I was 19, I transferred to Georgetown University to become an American Studies major. My plan was to follow my Uncle Jack, write a best-selling book, win a Pulitzer Prize, become a war hero, have a major health problem to overcome, and finally, at the age of 43, become President of the United States of America. I got 1 out of 5. Major health problem. In Georgetown, I moved in next door to a commune of heroin addicts. I said goodbye to Jefferson and Fitzgerald and hello to cops and to doctors. I had been using drugs for 6 years and never thought I had a problem. Becoming addicted to heroin told me something different. Addiction to any drug is like dancing with an 800-pound gorilla. You dance wherever and whenever that gorilla wants. I called a doctor I had seen in Boston and told him that I was addicted to drugs. My solution was to ask him to prescribe legal narcotics for me until I could figure out what to do about my problem. Maybe dance with a kinder, gentler 800-pound gorilla. I found out pretty quickly there's no such thing as a gentle 800-pound gorilla. This was also the first time I asked for help. The problem was I came up with my own treatment plan. You ask any addict how to treat addiction, and they will tell you, get more drugs. I spent the next 10 years convincing doctors to medicate my addiction. Drugs and alcohol took me to 3 jails and 3 intensive care units, landed me in the newspapers and on the evening news, damaged and permanently scarred my liver, heart, and lungs, significantly reduced the opportunities I was lucky to be born with, drove away most of the worthwhile people in my life, leaving behind a posse of lower companion bartenders, pharmacists, and drug dealers, and killed my cousin and my best friend in the world. I was physically, mentally, and spiritually bankrupt. I had finally hit bottom. I would bounce along that bottom for another 6 years. But I was finally somebody to cops and to doctors. It's not so bad, I thought. At least I wasn't dead. Many addicts will die before they surrender, and many of us stay active in our disease because of those that enable us. The last time I was arrested, the cops let me out the back door of their precinct because my uncle happened to be the United States Senator from their state. My privilege had once again allowed me to dodge another bullet. At the time, I was grateful. Today, I know that if I was held accountable that night and was able to access treatment, it might have been enough to change my trajectory. As it turned out, I got another 6 years of self-inflicted misery. Giving an addict or an alcoholic a get-out-of-jail-free card is never a good idea. If there's a back door, we'll use it. If there's an easier, softer way, sign us up. If there's another angle or long shot to play, we're in. It's what we do, and we will do it until we run out of options. Only then will we consider throwing in the towel. The next day, after I was arrested and let out the back door, I got a phone call from the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, who also happened to be my Uncle Teddy's campaign chairman for his presidential campaign. He was not happy. He told me that he was going to send over a very large, very mean state police officer to babysit me if I couldn't behave myself until the Massachusetts presidential primary, which was 1 month away. Some families plan interventions. In my family, intervention meant threatening phone calls from public officials. My family wanted to help me, but they were dealing with their own issues. And we didn't have nearly the amount of information back then that we do today. The ethic was damage control, instead of taking a proactive stand on getting me real help. And maybe it will go away, they thought, or get better. And if the outside stuff was looking okay, schools, jobs, not getting arrested, then I must be okay. And I was one of those addicts who appeared to be highly functional. I went through college, law school, and got a master's certification in clinical psychology from Harvard Medical School with an emphasis in addictive behavior, while fully enmeshed in my active addiction. I was dying inside, but as long as the outside was looking okay, we were cool. My Aunt Eunice Shriver, who was like a mother to me and started Special Olympics in her backyard, said to me once that as a family, we were great at dealing with the world's problems, but not very good at dealing with our own. My family had a difficult time confronting my problem. No way in the world would they accept that my problem was actually a family problem. My drug addiction caused my mother a lot of pain. And when I got sober, she appreciated that I wasn't overdosing or ending up on the evening news, but she didn't understand why I could no longer make the daiquiris. Despite what you see on Entertainment Tonight, addiction is not a bonus on either resume. After countless other disasters, I found myself in treatment where one of the doctors that I couldn't con suggested I go to a 12-step group, and when I got out, I did, and the seed to my recovery was planted. They say treatment and 12 steps will ruin your drinking and your using. There's nothing worse than a head full of recovery and a belly full of booze. But I still had a strong resistance to being told what to do by anybody, especially if it was good for me. Like most addicts, I only like advice if I agree with it. But the seed was planted, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I could no longer deny that there was a solution to my problem. After all, there was a room full of people who had apparently found a way out. My terminal uniqueness was shattered, but I still wasn't ready. I still didn't see addiction as a physical, mental, and spiritual disease. I thought that as long as I could control the physical part, I would be okay. Boy, was I wrong. C.S. Lewis said that in our adversity, God shouts to us. Well, he had been screaming at me for years, but I hadn't been listening. I had been trying to get sober for nine hard years, and there wasn't anything I hadn't tried. Geographics, changing girlfriends, shrinks, drug therapy, blocking agents, getting arrested, rehabs, locking myself in a room. I tried everything and nothing had worked. And if you had met me back then, you might have thought to yourself, you know, that Chris Lawford sure is a nice guy, but he's probably going to die. February 17th, 1986 was one of the coldest days ever recorded in the history of Boston, and I awoke that morning with a dread like nothing I had ever felt before. I had finally come to a place where I could say, this is bad enough. I stood there looking out over the city I had played for the past 10 years, knowing there were no more games that I could buy into. The jig was up, and the only answer for the pain in my gut was to put a gun in my mouth. Problem was I didn't have a gun. Plan B, there's always a plan B with us, was to finally throw in the towel. This was my moment of clarity, what Carl Jung, the great psychologist, called my psychic change moment. What Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, called my change of heart. I believe what happened that morning 26 years ago was a moment of grace, which humbled me, allowing me to surrender and find the key of willingness. Einstein said that we cannot solve the problems we have created with the same type of thinking that has created them. I became willing to accept that my best thinking had made quite a mess of things and that it was time for a change. I would do whatever I was told to do for the first time in my life. This was my introduction to humility. My journey began and the keys to my recovery were revealed. Trust something bigger than me, serve others, clean house. I know today that my journey to recovery started well before I stopped using drugs and alcohol. It began when I knew I had a problem and began my search to do something about it. I may have appeared lost, but from the moment I understood what my problem was, I was looking for the solution. The fact that it took someone like me, who had all of the resources and desire to get better as long as it did, reflects the immense challenge facing anyone with the courage and will to confront the 800-pound gorilla of addiction. There is a perception out in the world held by some that alcoholics and addicts are weak, have no willpower, are morally non-committal. I'll tell you what, you show me someone who has danced with an 800-pound gorilla for 5, 10, 15, 20 years while being punched in the face by that gorilla and lived to tell their story, and I will show you one tough, willful, committed human being. Addiction is a family disease. My father died of it when he was 60, and it destroyed his life and his relationships. One of the great gifts of recovery is breaking the chain of addiction in families. I had a fantasy ever since I was 6 years old, and I visited my dad on the set of Ocean's 11 at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, and I watched him and Uncle Frank and Dean and Sammy running around in those really cool suits with the skinny ties trying to steal all the money in the Vegas casinos. My fantasy was that one day my dad and I would work together and we would be able to have what I saw those guys have on that set that day. That never happened. The closest my father and I came to that kind of intimate collaborative camaraderie was on my 21st birthday at the Playboy Mansion when he gave me a vial of cocaine. It was the best either of us could do at the time. My dad loved me very much and was doing the best he could. It just wasn't very good. My father and the rest of those guys I saw on that day on the set of Ocean's 11 at the Sands Hotel had everything that you could possibly want in this world. And all of them died, more or less, of this disease, unhappy and miserable. My parents gave me valuable lessons about what not to do with my kids. I love them for that, and my kids will benefit from those lessons. I do things differently today with my children. Today, I am intimately involved in my children's lives in appropriate ways. I know what they are doing pretty much 24/7, whether they like it or not. I talk to them about where they come from and about genetic predisposition. They know my story and the promise, challenge, and wonder of a life lived in recovery. My dad couldn't do that for me, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. I am the father I am today because I'm in recovery. I am an example to my children that it is possible to overcome adversity and realize your dreams in spite of that adversity. I am an example that you don't need drugs and alcohol to get through a bad day. My kids know I don't need to get high to have fun, to laugh until my belly hurts, dance like a wild man, have a world full of really good friends, fall in and out of love, be respected and listened to by drunks or policymakers, and sometimes by drunk policymakers. My children know it is possible to find the courage to show up on a movie set and shoot a scene with Sir Anthony Hopkins, write your first book when you don't know how to type, or give a policy speech at the UN and change yourself many, many times in recovery. I spent 20 years in my disease trying to be somebody, then got sober and realized I had to entirely change who I was. There's a fiction out there that once you sober up an alcoholic or a drug addict, your work is done. This is not true. Bill Wilson said that when you sober up a horse thief, you've got a sober horse thief. It is possible and relatively easy to remain just as despicable sober as you ever were when you were using, just not be quite as obvious about it. Alcohol and drugs are merely symptoms of a more pervasive, fundamental disease, a disease of attitudes and perception. This is why it is critical for the addict to find a basis for living that will allow us to change. Mahatma Gandhi, who knew a thing or two about self-change, said that the man or woman who changes himself is greater than the man or woman who conquers 10,000 armies. This is cleaning house, and it is very difficult to do. I have changed a lot in my recovery. Not all of it is good, and it sure isn't easy. Change is the vital essence of recovery. It is also thrilling, honest, expansive, and unpredictable. Change and authenticity is what I always wanted out of life. The reason a lot of folks who need treatment don't think it works is because the only people they hear about treatment from are the people that it didn't work for. They are the ones on television or the ones who return to their communities as examples of the hopelessness of addiction. The people who treatment did work for rarely go back to tell their story. This is why I believe those of us who have found a way out share a responsibility to go back to the places we came from with a positive message of hope that treatment does work. Today, I have a life beyond my wildest dreams. I've stayed sober for 26 years. My greatest liabilities have become my greatest assets. Today, I contribute to society rather than take from society. I have 3 children who only know me as a father in recovery. I have broken the chain of addiction in my family and learned how to be a committed and present father. I've made movies with Anthony Hopkins, Kevin Costner, Sean Connery, Richard Dreyfuss. I'm a best-selling author who's published 4 books, 2 of which have been on the New York Times bestseller list. Today, I'm a Goodwill Ambassador for the UN, and I speak all over the country and the world for the UN, the White House, and others on addiction, recovery, and hepatitis C awareness. When in 2001, I was 17 years sober, I was diagnosed with hepatitis C, and I was treated. I have a message today that hepatitis C is curable and treatable. And this is an issue that affects many in our population. After a lifetime of trying to be what I thought everyone wanted me to be, I have found myself in all that I come from. Today, I am somebody. Not because of the movies or the best-selling books or the things in my life, but because in recovery, I get to use my experience, strength, and hope to help others change their life if they want to. As I said in the beginning, addiction ignores power and privilege. This means that recovery must also ignore power and privilege. The disease doesn't care who you are, and neither should recovery. There is much for us to do. I am committed to be a voice that will speak out against stigma, discrimination, and violence perpetrated against those of us who have this illness. A voice with a clear message that recovery equals empowerment, so people know what's in store for them when they find a way out of the hell of their addiction, no matter how many times they falter or how long it takes. And a voice that will ask all of us to stay focused on the underlying societal causes and conditions that lock people in the hopelessness and despair of the addictive cycle, keeping their recovery illusory and unattainable. I am not doing this because I'm a good guy. I'm doing it because my recovery demands it and flourishes because of it, and because I love addicts and alcoholics. They're my tribe. And I have no doubt that if I spend my days giving to others what I have received, the wonder and abundance I've experienced in my life as a result of being rocketed into the fourth dimension of recovery will continue to surprise me beyond my wildest dreams. Thanks a lot.